Today we're adding a gel insert and cutting out the forward tilt on my tracer seat. And as always, in the description there will be timestamps so you can skip to the parts that matter to you. And just as a quick note, YouTube has stopped recommending my videos, so be sure to like, sub, and share if you think my videos are worth more than 1 or 200 views. Otherwise, thumbs down. Not that YouTube will show me that. As for the bike, I keep it in the tall setting. I do this not because I want it taller, but because the seat has a forward tilt, and it only raises the front of the bike when you put it in the tall setting. So the plan is I'm going to cut down the rear of the foam and then add a gel pad as an insert. The reason for the gel pad is this is not a terrible seat for a 3 or 4 hour ride, but most of my rides are 6 to 10 hours. And if I screw it up, you can see here I have a universal gel pad, which I'll link below. And after having it on 3 bikes and over 30,000 kilometers, I do highly recommend it if you don't want to get a custom seat or make a custom seat, or if you switch bikes a lot and don't want to buy a bunch of seats. And real quick, here's a picture of all the tools and materials that I used for it. There are no sponsors. This is just things I had or things I bought. You pick whatever works for you. And without further ado,
here we go.
I'm using the knife that my friend made me and pliers to pull out all the staples to remove the seat cover, and I just want to point out that this is being played at 6 times speed. I was being very careful to keep the knife's sharp edges away from my fingers as much as possible, and you should be very careful if you do this. And as a disclaimer, I am not recommending you do any of this. Modify your own bike at your own risk, because there's a very good chance that I end up ruining a perfectly good seat. And on the topic of ruining the seat, using a knife here means you could cut the seat, so you have to be very careful not to cut up the cover, which I successfully managed to keep the cover all in one good piece. You could use a screwdriver for this, but I don't have a thin enough screwdriver, and I do own a knife, so why spend the money? Now that we got the cover off and the seat's back on the bike, you can see here that it's not a perfectly level seat. So as I begin cutting it down, the reason I'm using a kitchen knife to cut it is because A, Japanese tend to make very good kitchen knives, and B, it's a very long, strong, and flat blade, so it's easier to get a relatively good cut. And again, this is still 6 times speed, but I actually did it very slowly and tried as much as I could to cut away from my fingers to make sure I have all 10, or well, maybe 9 by the end of it, still attached to my hand. And it's worth mentioning that this foam is relatively easy to rip when you're cutting it. That's why you want to use an extremely sharp knife, and I am quite religious about keeping my knife sharp. And just a fun fact, even though a dull knife might be less likely to cut you, a sharp knife is less likely to give you a bad cut, and less likely to give you an infection. So when you're cutting yourself, maybe I should word that better. I thought I'd pop back in here to point out that I'm only cutting off little bits at this point because this doesn't grow back, and whatever you cut off is cut off. So making little adjustments is important rather than cutting too much, because you can always cut more, but it's not very realistic to put more back on. Now I'm just dusting it off real quick and checking the flatness to see how it feels. I took it off the center stand really quick because the center stand gives the whole bike a slight forward lean. So I want to feel how it naturally is on 2 wheels. Here you can see I'm slightly trying to keep the roundness of the edge of the seat for the sake of comfort on my inner leg. That'll be mostly fixed by the foam when I'm recovering the seat later. But what you also might be noticing is when I get close to the edge, I'm really focusing on holding the foam down. That's because the foam is not glued to the seat. I could pull the entire foam off of the seat right now. That's another thing you'll have to be careful about, especially when you're getting to the thinner parts of the foam. One more check to see if it's level, and if I like the comfort and the way it feels. I'm getting low to eyeball it, and as you can see here, it does in fact look much more flat than before. Now that we're back inside, we take the gel to cut out all the excess plastic. The next thing is we see which way we want it to fit, and I'm going with the slightly wider way. And after that, you get your measuring tool to measure the center line of the seat foam. Then you do the same thing on the gel, just to make sure everything's relatively even. And once you have that center line, you trace where you want to cut out the edges to avoid the overlap, and then you only cut one side. After you cut that one side, you can use it to trace out the second side, this way making it relatively even. Since I already traced out where the gel pad is going to go, I can actually take these two extra scraps and make it slightly wider in the back, because some may say that I have a precipitous amount of junk in my trunk. Now as for this part, it would be easier if you had a proper straight edge, but anything really will do, because this is cutting out parts that will become ultimately trash, and the only proper line needs to be the outline. But what I'm doing is drawing a grid pattern, so that when I cut it out with that white razor blade you see, I can make little chunks that are easy to remove and give a relatively flat finish for the gel pad. Now what I'm doing here is measuring the blade's thickness against the gel pad thickness, so I know exactly how deep to cut. I don't want to cut too shallow or I'll have to do it again. I don't want to cut too deep or have taken out too much and you won't have a flat seat and you'll have a bit of an indent when you're done. And it's also good to notice here how I saw the blade in at the beginning and at the end to make sure it's a smooth, even line that's not just ripping without again being too shallow or not deep enough. This is again another point where it's important to have a properly sharp blade, because if you don't, you'll just be pulling and ripping the seat apart. From here you'll notice that I drew the lines a bit wider than I actually wanted, so instead of going back and redrawing, I just cut new lines because again, this is just going to be scrap in the end. It doesn't need to be a perfect millimeter to millimeter measurement and cut. Now that the whole grid is cut out, I use these pliers to pull out each individual piece slowly and carefully so that it's not ripping a hole or ripping too deep, and I can easily go back and rip a bit more if it didn't come off enough. So again, slow and careful is the most important thing to do. At this point, after cutting a few more lines a bit thinner, I realized foam is just foam. Why use something cumbersome like a tool when my fingers can do the job just as good, if not a bit better? And sorry if it's not quite easy to see here, but I'm not actually pulling. What I'm doing is sometimes twisting, but mostly trying to slowly roll it out to get a relatively straight line rip along with the grid pattern cutting. And here you'll notice some of the black plastic showing through because remember earlier how I thinned out the seat in the back, but this is not a problem because that'll still be covered by the gel, so it won't actually be hard plastic that I'm sitting on. And as you can see with some of these in the back, because it's getting so thin, you don't want to rip too much, so using the razor blade to cut it out can be better than just rolling or ripping them out. Now that I've won my game of Tetris, I'm doing a quick little spot check before I start fitting the gel. Because of the plastic, the little scrap winglets stick up a bit too much and the razor blade can't cut the gel, so I'm just using the scissors to thin it out a little bit and to remold the shape of it with the scraps that I cut off. Now I'm starting to peel off the plastic layering on the scrap sides and eventually on the whole thing. What you need to know is it's not as sticky as glue, but it's incredibly sticky once you peel off the plastic. As you'll see later, this causes me quite a bit of trouble once I've peeled off both sides. Now that you've managed to peel off the plastic, what you do is you get spray adhesive and put on a liberal amount on both sides so that it becomes sticky. And now the important thing to do is to not tell your wife that you sprayed it on her table and you definitely didn't get any glue stuck to anything else. Now after you've done all that, you want to wait a good minute or two before you start sticking it in place so that it becomes tacky enough to stick to each other. Between the stickiness of the glue, but also the stickiness of the gel, this was a very difficult part for me to do. So I'm sure there's a better way to do it, maybe leaving the top layer of plastic on before you get it all set. That's not what I did, and here we see the results of that clever move. After cleaning up, you see that I have the spray adhesive again to fix the gel a bit more and then to spray a layer over the seat and gel. After that, you'll see that I'm spraying it on this thin foam layer. The purpose of this foam layer is to go between the seat foam and the gel and then the outer cover. The reason for this is gel holds heat or cold. So if it gets hot in the summer, that foam layer gives you a bit of a protection against the heat. Whereas if it gets cold, again, you don't freeze your bits. And this is as good a time as any to cut out the extra foam, but don't do it too quick because you don't want your scissors to get all gunked up with the glue. So you want it dry enough that this part's relatively effortless. And then it's not a bad idea to have a little extra spray adhesive on the underside to fit the rest of the foam to the seat pan. And like before, I edited out a 2-minute wait and a bathroom break before actually folding over the foam. Here one last time with the spray adhesive because we have the plastic layer to make sure that the seat is actually rainproof, and I edited out one last waiting period. If you don't remember to use the plastic layer, that means next time it rains, your seat soaks, and then your butt soaks the next time you ride. Assuming you have a standard seat like 99% of the bikes out there with an ABS plastic construction, a simple staple gun will do for putting it back together. The important thing to notice here is how I stretch the cover over the seat, and I go from front to back, left to right before doing the whole ring around. That's because, like putting on a car tire, if you do one side too tight before doing the other ones, the whole thing comes out uneven. Unlike a tire, it won't kill you, but it will look bad if you stretch the front and not the back, or you stretch the left and not the right. So going back and forth from side to side, front to back, is a really good way to get a good finish, as you'll see when I'm done. Okay, there we go. I'll put it back on the bike and see how it fits. So there you go. As you can see here, it is much flatter than stock, which does help with the comfort, but the finish does not look handmade, which is the goal of a handmade custom part, to look as good as a factory part. As for comfort, I took it for a 20-minute ride around Tokyo, and it is more comfortable than stock. I'm not entirely sure if it's as comfortable as the gel pad I was using before, but I still have that just in case. I'll have to go for a much longer ride to determine how comfortable it actually is. And once I've done that, I will pin a comment below to say exactly how good or bad it turned out. But till then, thanks for watching. This has been Kairyu Rider.